rocking and rolling and saying, hey, if Sean O'Malley can get up to number 1 in this division, then so can I. We have Tiger Schulman's co-owner of the gym. It's Julio Arce taking on Pura Vida BJJ's own Montel Quik Jackson. An absolute banger at bantamweight. I'm going to start it off here, Matt, because this is a little bit of a soft handoff. When Julio Arce came into the UFC, he beat Dan Ige at UFC 220. He won me over. I was all about it. And listen, I looked at Julio Arce as one of those guys that I thought was going to make a run at featherweight. He wins a number of fights there, but then he decided, hey, well, you know, I used to be pretty good at bantamweight. I'm going to move it back on over to bantamweight. I didn't think he'd continue on at bantamweight. Now he's 2-1 in this division, but I didn't think the long-term future would be here, but we're still rocking and rolling and trying to do it at 130.
We are, and it has been impressive, but the weird thing about Julio Arce is it always comes down to who his opponent is and how you feel about how he's going to do in the fight. I know that's a cryptic way of predicting it, but still, for Julio Arce, it does feel like when he fights that next level of prospect, he does struggle with them. But if you are going to be kind of an outside the top 15 guy, he's going to look very good in that type of performance. And that's where it kind of gets brought back to Montel Jackson. It's, hey, what do you really think of him at this stage of his career? Because when you look at his 2 losses in the UFC, they're to 2 very talented fighters. To Brett Johns, who I know isn't around anymore. He's now in Bellator, I believe. Yep. But Brett Johns is an extremely talented grappler, very unorthodox style of grappler as well. And Ricky Simone, a guy who many of you have probably heard of, one of the better fighters in this division. And both those guys follow very similar gameplays. They use their wrestling a lot, and they were able to really ground out a guy like Montel Jackson. But
go ahead. No, I mean, the weirdest part about it is Montel Jackson, they're going to talk about it on
grappler.
Every single card. They're going to say, hey, he was an Olympic hopeful in wrestling, and when the Olympics when wrestling was abolished, squashed in the Olympics, Jackson started to train for MMA. He has a skill set somewhat similar to Molly McCann, who's also on this card, where when Molly is the hammer and you're poor at wrestling, you become the nail. But for Montel Jackson, yeah, he really struggled with the wrestling of Ricky Simone, really struggled against Brett Johns. JP Bays had a little bit of success in the first round of their fight, and JP almost had him completely submitted twice in the first round of their fight.
Montel Jackson looked about as nervous as Mariano Rivera did in a save, though. He was in a rear naked choke, and the expression on his face was just like,
hey,
he was
next
just
pitch, it's going to be a cutter.
Montel Jackson wasn't concerned at all in his last fight against JP's. Now, he looked great in that matchup, and unfortunately for JP's, didn't have a great run. JP's, sorry. Unfortunately for JP, he didn't have the best run in the UFC, so it is very difficult to gauge how good Montel Jackson is based on that performance, because he had multiple knockdowns, he was able to defend a lot of takedowns, looked really good on the feet too. But for Jackson, he does have good offensive grappling, I would say. He's a slick guy on the ground with some of his own transitions. He can threaten with a lot of submissions as well. We know how good his boxing is. He has very heavy hands, especially from the outside. But against a guy like Julio Arce, I'm going to be very curious to see what's Jackson's game plan. Is he going to be comfortable to be on the feet at range? Because I do think Arce has a wider array of strikes at his disposal. Now, does that mean he's a better striker? Maybe not, but I do think he does have more kicks to throw. I think he throws more knees. I just like the variety of strikes he throws on the feet a little bit more, and that's why I'm so interested in this fight. But I'll just go back to the point I made before we started filming. This whole card has great fights from the start of the card all the way up to the top.
So when you do look at this one, Julio Arce trained as a boxer. He's a southpaw. Montel Jackson also a southpaw. And for Arce's last time out, I had a little bit of fun with the graphics, and I didn't put Daniel Santos. I put Daniel Willie Cat. And against Willie Cat, Julio Arce missed weight. Came in at 136.5. Got the win. A win that now ages well because of how Willie Cat withstood the first round against Castaneda and then finished him in the second round. But for Arce, it was pressure. It was volume. And if I have to, I'll defend a takedown. For Arce, 94% takedown defense in the UFC. It's a big portion of his game, considering how good of a boxer he is. And I listened to an Arce interview that he did with All-Star, which is, of course, GHK. And over there, it was, well, I'll have to pressure him. And he knows that Jackson's going to have that 3 inches of height, 5.5 inches of reach. And Arce talked about the fact that I already fought Julian Rosa, who's taller and longer, or as long as Montel Jackson, who's also a southpaw, because he will switch stances. And he already beat Andre Ewell, who does possess those same gifts of having the length that a guy like Montel Jackson has. So for Arce, the thing that I go back to is he's much more active on the feet. And he's one of those guys that dips in and out so quickly, utilizes the footwork, utilizes his speed, and throws a lot in his combinations. And for Jackson, He will toss a 1-2. He will pop the jab out there, but it's that piston left hand that hits so friggin' hard. You consider it for Montel Jackson, UFC and Dana White's Contender Series, 10 knockdowns. But 8 of those knockdowns are in the UFC. That's tied for 5th in bantamweight history. Number 1 all time, Chito Vera with 10. So for Montel Jackson, knocking guys dead, 4 knockdowns against JP Buys his last time out. That was tough to watch. Really had a lot of success. Round 2, round 3, round 1. JP looked pretty darn good. I'm just eager to see. Will the lower volume, I'm downloading your game plan of Montel Jackson, will that be able to be enough? And I know how good his power is, how good his wrestling is, how good his grappling is, but is it enough to withstand the pressure and the volume of Julio Arce? I think that's a big question out of all of this fight.
It definitely is, but the good thing about Jackson in the way that he does like to download guys' game plan is he carries his power late into the fight. Like against JP, he wasn't knocking him down early in the fight. It was later on when both guys were tired. That's the good thing about Jackson. He can kind of give away rounds, and that's a difficult thing to do in 3-round fights because again, if you give away the first 2 rounds, you better be pretty damn confident in your ability to finish your opponent in the third. But so far, Jackson has shown the ability to damage his opponent when he really needs to. And I'm glad you bring up the reach and the height difference because that's the thing, skill set for skill set. I do think Julio Arce is a difficult striker for a guy like Montel Jackson to deal with, but the fact that Jackson does have 5.5 inches of reach on his side and that he uses his boxing a lot, I think does help him quite a bit in this matchup.
I think it actually favors Arce in the matchup, and he has teammates that are on this card, or at least one, and Mike Trizano, who's going to be fighting, so make sure you check out that video. The other guy that he trains with primarily, Shane Burgos, the PFL's own, but he's been training with a lot of pro boxers getting ready for this matchup. So you do have a look at it. For Arce, he's been favored in all but one UFC fight.
Really?
The fight that he had against Song Yadong, he was the underdog. He's 5-2 as a favorite. For Montel Jackson, a favorite in all of his UFC fights. 5-2 there. And if you do look at it, he's been a -600 or -600 adjacent in 3 of his fights. One against Andre Sukumtoth, a boxer that will walk you down. One against Felipe Kolares. One against Jesse Strader. And one against JP Buys. Jesse Strader, that was a tough fight for old Jesse. But Matt, when you do focus in on this one, it is a slightly above UFC average output for Montel Jackson, tied for 6th all-time in UFC history for strikes absorbed per minute at 1.28. So Jackson in and out, doesn't get hit a lot, can lean back, can throw that front hand out there. And the good thing about Jackson is usually leads the dance with his foot position, and he likes to hand fight and keep that lead hand out there. He's not pawing with a jab, he's holding it out there so then he can land that piston left, as we said. So you look at the odds in the matchup. Arce open a +130 underdog, +172. Montel Jackson open -150, -211. You have a look at the Tapology votes. Surprised to us as they are to you. I'm going to assume that they're a little bit whack, and I'm going to say over under 80% Montel Jackson.
I'll say under.
You're going to say under. It's slightly under. 856 total votes, 72% Jackson, 76% by decision. For the 28% that have Arce, 81% by decision. So most people seeing this one going to a decision. And I think if people think it's going to go to a decision, I think Julio Arce wins. Better volume, good takedown defense, and that's against decent wrestlers. I think Arce would win a decision. Now, when I went in just blind without watching any of the tape, I had Montel Jackson to win this fight. I have a hard time, though, seeing him beating Julio Arce in a decision.
I still do have Montel Jackson to fight for this reason. I think he can drop Arce, and that's going to erase a lot of volume done by Arce leading up to those big moments by Montel Jackson. I'm not saying I'm right just because I'm making this point, but the fact that Jackson is able to carry his power very late, the fact that, like you said, it's not like he doesn't throw volume. He is above the UFC average in volume landed per minute.
3.42 significant strikes per minute. The UFC average is 3.39, so barely above the average.
But still, a guy who has that much power to be above the average is a good sign, and I do think that the fact that he does carry his power late is going to be enough. And we've only really seen Jackson struggle with very pressure-heavy wrestlers in the UFC up until this point. Julio Arce doesn't necessarily have that type of a game plan. I think, if anything, Jackson might be the most likely to shoot for an offensive takedown, so that's why I do find myself ever so slightly favoring Montel Jackson, but this is one of those early card fight of the night potential fights without a doubt. Like, this could be an incredible fight.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing for Jackson when he does throw the left hand out there, like, he's not giving you a little bit of a taste like when you're at Costco and you're trying kind of sampler.
Oh, he gives you the whole thing.
He's packing the whole damn thing down your throat, and you're going to like it or you're not. And when you do focus in on the matchup for Jackson, he's been out for just over a year, picking up that big win over JP Buys. He withdrew from a fight earlier on this year. It was actually earlier on, really early on in the year against Tana Bakary, withdrew from that one in the spring. And for Arce, he has been active at 135, picking up 2 wins to the 1 loss. The 2 wins, Andre Ewell finished him, the win that he has over Daniel Santos. And of course, he did get beat by Sung Yadong, a guy who,
it happens.
You know, he lost to Corey Sandhagen, is what it is. I have Montel Jackson by a squeaker of a hair. I think the wrestling's the difference with the grappling. I like that Arce's trained with a lot of boxers. I love the volume, and I think he can mix in those power shots. The nice thing that I like out of Arce is as soon as he throws a couple of rights out there to bait you, he'll go down, switch to the body, land a couple of tidy shots, and he's out before he takes any damage. But I think Jackson, the damaging left hand that Arce already knows about, the grappling prowess that he has, I have Jackson. I don't necessarily love the minus 200 line, but again, Jackson in the UFC has been at or around minus 600 4 times, and he's 5-2 in the UFC. So both of us going with Montel Jackson to get the win. Some big-time fights on this card, including Poirier and Chandler. The 2 title fights up at the top. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.